December 7th, 1941. It was a peaceful Sunday morning in paradise. The Hawaiian sun was rising over Pearl Harbor, casting golden reflections across the calm waters of the Pacific. American sailors were sleeping in their bunks aboard the mighty battleships of the Pacific Fleet. Some were preparing for church services, others writing letters home, and many were simply enjoying a rare day of rest. In a few hours, this tranquil scene would be transformed into a vision of hell, and America would be thrust into the greatest war in human history.
The United States had been desperately trying to stay out of the global conflict that had been raging since 1939. While Europe burned under Nazi occupation and Asia suffered under Japanese conquest, America clung to its policy of neutrality. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been gradually moving the nation closer to supporting the Allies, but the American people remained deeply reluctant to enter another world war. Many remembered the horrors of World War I and wanted no part of another European conflict. But on this quiet Sunday morning, that choice would be taken away from them in the most dramatic and shocking way possible. Pearl Harbor was home to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the most powerful naval force in the Pacific Ocean. 8 massive battleships lay at anchor in what was called Battleship Row, their steel hulls gleaming in the morning sun. The USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, and 5 others represented the backbone of American naval power. Nearby, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines filled the harbor. Nearly 100 American warships were anchored in the harbor that morning, along with hundreds of aircraft at the adjacent airfields. More than 2,400 American servicemen were stationed at Pearl Harbor and the surrounding military installations. These were young men from every corner of America, farm boys from Iowa, city kids from New York, cowboys from Texas. They had joined the Navy and Army to serve their country, but most never expected to see combat. America was at peace, and Pearl Harbor seemed like the safest assignment in the world, a tropical paradise far from any potential conflict. Unknown to the sleeping Americans, a massive Japanese naval force was approaching from the north. For weeks, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been planning the most audacious naval attack in history. The Japanese Empire was expanding rapidly across the Pacific, conquering the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the Dutch East Indies. But they knew that eventually America would have to be dealt with. The U.S. Pacific Fleet posed the greatest threat to Japanese ambitions, and Yamamoto believed that a surprise attack could cripple American naval power for years. The Japanese strike force consisted of 6 aircraft carriers carrying 414 planes, along with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. They had sailed in complete radio silence across 3,500 miles of empty ocean, maintaining the element of surprise that would be crucial to their success. The attack had been planned with meticulous precision, with Japanese pilots studying detailed models of Pearl Harbor and practicing their attack runs for months. At 6 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off from their carriers 230 miles north of Hawaii. 183 planes roared into the sky, loaded with bombs and torpedoes, their pilots eager for battle. They flew in perfect formation through the clear morning air, navigating by the signals from Honolulu radio stations that were playing peaceful Sunday morning music. The irony was cruel. American radio waves guiding Japanese bombers to their target. At 7:02 a.m., 2 Army privates operating a mobile radar station on Oahu detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. They immediately called their commanding officer, but he dismissed the sighting, assuming it was a flight of American B-17 bombers expected to arrive from California that morning. This tragic mistake cost America its last chance to prepare for what was coming. The radar operators watched helplessly as the blips on their screen grew larger and larger. At exactly 7:55 a.m., the peaceful Sunday morning exploded into chaos. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the first wave of attackers, looked down at the American fleet spread out below him like sitting ducks and gave the order that would change history. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code words that meant complete surprise had been achieved. The first bombs fell on Ford Island, where American aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, making perfect targets. Within minutes, most of the U.S. planes were destroyed on the ground, eliminating any possibility of an effective American air response. Then the torpedo bombers began their attack runs on Battleship Row, their specially modified torpedoes designed to run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman First Class Russell Lott was getting ready for church services when the first explosion rocked the ship. Like most of the crew, he thought it was some kind of drill or accident. Then he saw the Japanese planes with their distinctive red, rising sun markings diving toward his ship, and the horrible reality hit him. America was under attack. The USS Oklahoma was among the first ships hit, struck by multiple torpedoes that caused her to roll over and sink within minutes. 429 sailors were trapped inside the overturned hull. Some would be rescued by cutting through the steel, but many would never see daylight again. The USS West Virginia took 7 torpedo hits and began settling into the harbor mud, her captain mortally wounded on the bridge. At 8:06 a.m., a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb penetrated the forward magazine of the USS Arizona. The explosion was so massive it lifted the 32,000-ton battleship out of the water and broke her in half.
Of all the American casualties that day, the Arizona became a tomb for those brave men, and she remains one to this day.
As the attack continued, American servicemen throughout the harbor began fighting back with whatever weapons they could find. Many ran to unmanned anti-aircraft guns, firing back at the Japanese planes without training or preparation. Petty Officer Doris Miller, an African-American cook aboard the USS West Virginia, carried wounded sailors to safety and then manned a machine gun he had never been trained to use, shooting down at least one Japanese plane. His heroism would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African Americans to receive such a high decoration. The second wave of Japanese attackers arrived at 8:50 a.m., consisting of 170 more planes. They focused on the ships that had survived the first attack and the repair facilities that would be needed to get the fleet back into action. Dive bombers screamed down from the sky while fighter planes strafed anything that moved. The harbor was now a scene of absolute devastation, with burning ships, floating debris, and thick black smoke that could be seen for miles. Young sailors who had been sleeping peacefully just 2 hours earlier now found themselves fighting for their lives in a scene from hell. The water was covered with burning oil, and men swam through flames to reach safety. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat the wounded, setting up aid stations wherever they could find space. The hospital at Pearl Harbor was overwhelmed with casualties, and doctors worked without rest to save as many lives as possible. At nearby Hickam Field and Wheeler Field, the Army Air Corps suffered devastating losses. Most of their planes were destroyed on the ground, lined up in neat rows that made them easy targets for Japanese strafing runs. Of the 231 Army aircraft on Oahu, only 43 were left undamaged after the attack. The few American planes that managed to get airborne fought valiantly but were vastly outnumbered. Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach their P-40 fighter planes at Haleiwa Field and took off in the middle of the attack. They shot down 6 Japanese planes between them, proving that American pilots could fight when given the chance. But their heroics were isolated bright spots in an otherwise dark day for American arms. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese planes regrouped and headed back to their carriers, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented destruction. The mighty U.S. Pacific Fleet had been crippled in less than 2 hours. 4 battleships were sunk, 4 others severely damaged. 11 other ships were sunk or damaged, and 188 aircraft were destroyed. Most devastating of all, 2,403 Americans were dead, and 1,178 were wounded. The Japanese losses were minimal, just 29 planes shot down and 65 men killed. From a tactical standpoint, the attack was a stunning success.
Admiral Yamamoto had achieved his goal of crippling American naval power in the Pacific. But strategically, the attack would prove to be one of the greatest mistakes in military history.
As news of the attack spread across America, the shock and outrage were immediate and overwhelming. Americans gathered around their radios to hear the reports of the devastating surprise attack. President Roosevelt was meeting with his advisors when the news arrived, and he immediately began preparing for what he knew would be America's entry into World War II. The age of American neutrality was over. The attack united the American people as nothing else could have. The isolationist movement, which had been strong just hours before, collapsed overnight. Americans who had been reluctant to enter another foreign war now demanded revenge against Japan. Young men lined up at recruiting stations across the country, eager to serve their country and avenge Pearl Harbor. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared awakening was now fully aroused. On December 8th, President Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Japan. His words would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress approved the declaration of war with only one dissenting vote. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed America from a reluctant neutral into the leader of the free world. The industrial might of the United States was mobilized for total war, producing ships, planes, tanks, and weapons at a rate that would have seemed impossible just months before. American factories that had been making cars and refrigerators began churning out the tools of war 24 hours a day. The men who died at Pearl Harbor did not die in vain. Their sacrifice awakened America to the reality of the global threat posed by fascism and militarism. The Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry that sustained the American war effort through 4 long years of global conflict. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose the greatest military force in human history, one that would ultimately triumph over the forces of tyranny in both the Pacific and Europe. Admiral Yamamoto himself recognized the long-term consequences of his success. He reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His fears would prove prophetic. December 7th, 1941 was indeed a date that would live in infamy, but it was also the day that America found its destiny as the defender of freedom around the world. The shock that pulled the United States into World War II ultimately led to victory over Askism and the emergence of America as the leader of the free world. Pearl Harbor was a day of tragedy, but it was also the day that America truly became America.